They say, wars start with missiles. But what if the next global conflict begins with cargo ships? Russia just changed the rules of the game not with tanks or jets, but with $3 billion worth of seized commercial vessels. 12 ships, 3 seas. One silent, devastating move that sent shockwaves through global trade routes. I'm Ray McGovern. I spent nearly 3 decades inside the CIA, studying global power struggles. I've briefed presidents, tracked covert operations, and watched superpowers quietly battle for control over the world's most valuable assets. But what just unfolded in the Arctic, Baltic, and Black Seas isn't just retaliation for Western sanctions. It's a complete shift in how economic warfare is fought. And the target this time wasn't a nation. It was the very system we all depend on: commercial shipping. At first glance, it might look like an impulsive act, a sudden outburst triggered by economic pressure. But that's not what happened here. This wasn't a reaction, it was a strategy. Russia's operation was meticulously planned, perfectly timed, and executed with a precision that only comes from military coordination. It was no coincidence that 12 vessels were hit across 3 separate seas at the exact same time. This wasn't maritime piracy, nor was it an act of desperation. It was a message. Russia was telling the world that sanctions cut both ways. And the way they delivered that message? Through an operation that had been in the works for months. What you won't hear in most media reports is that this strike was anything but random. Russian naval intelligence had been tracking each of those ships for weeks. They knew every detail: cargo types, shipping routes, insurance providers, and even the web of corporate entities that technically owned them. This was not a spontaneous seizure. It was deliberate, precise, and devastating. A new kind of warfare: economic, silent, and without a single shot fired. The West didn't just get outmaneuvered. It walked straight into the trap. To grasp how significant this is, we need to step back and understand the rules Russia just broke and rewrote. For decades, commercial vessels were considered untouchable. Even during wartime, merchant ships, unless clearly carrying military aid, were allowed to move freely through international waters. That unspoken agreement is what kept global trade flowing, even in tense times. But the moment Western countries began freezing Russian assets and blocking Russian ships, that old agreement crumbled. Russia responded by doing the same and then going further. What they did in these 3 seas wasn't technically illegal. It was something far more dangerous. It was legal under a new rule book that they are now writing in real time. The operation began at precisely 3 a.m. Moscow time. Russian naval units launched simultaneous actions in 3 regions. In the Baltic Sea, 2 commercial vessels were intercepted near Kaliningrad. In the Black Sea, 4 more were taken near Crimea. And in the Arctic, 6 ships were boarded along the Northern Sea route. Not a single warning was issued. Not a single country was notified. Just like that, 12 ships gone. $3 billion in cargo, rerouted or seized. All of it perfectly timed. But here's where Russia's strategy really shows. They didn't just grab random ships. They waited until those vessels were at their most valuable. Full oil tankers, container ships brimming with European goods, LNG carriers en route to energy-hungry Western markets. Russia didn't just seize hardware, they seized influence. Each of those ships now represents layers of economic fallout. Insurance claims in the millions. Deliveries delayed by weeks or months. Legal disputes that will drag on for years. And the ripple effect? Insurance premiums across the entire shipping industry are skyrocketing. Companies are scrambling to reroute, and global trade just got a lot more expensive and risky. But economic disruption is only the surface. What lies underneath is a far more dangerous reality, one that should have every policymaker in the West losing sleep. This wasn't about money, it was about control. Russia just demonstrated total command over 3 critical maritime regions, places the West either can't reach or dares not contest. In the Arctic, those seizures happened along the Northern Sea route waters that Russia claims as its own, a claim the West disputes but has no way to enforce. With Russian nuclear icebreakers and naval bases in the region, that route is effectively under Moscow's control. In the Black Sea, the operation occurred near Crimea, which has been turned into a fortress. No Western vessel can enter those waters without Russian permission, and NATO knows it. That's why no one responded. And in the Baltic, where the move was most provocative, Russia was careful. They struck just outside the radius where NATO would be forced to respond militarily. It was bold, it was precise. And under this new global order, it was technically legal. But the most chilling part? Russia used Western legal logic to justify every move. Remember when Western governments started seizing Russian oligarch yachts? The rationale was simple. If someone is linked to a sanctioned regime, their property is fair game. Russia took that exact argument and flipped it. These weren't just ships, they were owned by companies in countries supporting Ukraine. That made them legitimate targets. Under the same rules the West wrote. When NATO froze Russian assets, it claimed it was justified by economic aggression. Russia adopted the same language. When the EU blocked Russian vessels from ports, it set a precedent. Russia simply made that precedent mutual. Every legal step Russia has taken has been a mirror. They're not inventing new laws. They're holding up the West laws and asking, why shouldn't we do the same? And that's what makes this so unsettling. Once you accept that commercial vessels can be targeted in an economic conflict, you can't undo it. That line has been crossed. The insurance industry understands this already. Lloyd's of London has suspended coverage for any ship passing through Russian-controlled waters without explicit clearance. Rates for the Arctic, Baltic, and Black Sea have tripled. Some shipping companies are abandoning those routes altogether, adding days or weeks to transport timelines and millions to operating costs. A fragile global supply chain, already weakened by a pandemic and canal blockages, is now undergoing a permanent transformation. This wasn't a message, it was a blueprint. And here's where the real danger unfolds. The ripple effects of this operation aren't just economic, they're geopolitical. Russia didn't just hit the West in the pocketbook. They rewrote the entire rule book of international conflict, and they did it in a way that every sanctioned country on earth is now watching very closely. Because what Russia pulled off wasn't an isolated move, it was a demonstration. A masterclass in turning the West's own tactics against it. Countries like China, Iran, North Korea, and Venezuela have all been studying the effectiveness of Western sanctions for years. They've seen their own economies squeezed, their trade routes monitored, their access to financial systems throttled. But now they've seen something else. That sanctions can be answered not with counter-sanctions, but with something far more potent: control over maritime trade. Look at the South China Sea. China already asserts sweeping claims over these waters, claims the West disputes, but hasn't been able to stop. If China were to apply Russia's new maritime playbook, they could begin intercepting ships that violate what they see as their territorial boundaries, using the same legal arguments the West used against Russia. The Strait of Hormuz? Iran could decide that tankers passing through without permission are fair game, especially if they're flagged to nations enforcing sanctions against Iran. It's no longer about firing missiles or blockading ports. It's about identifying the legal gray areas created by Western sanctions and weaponizing them with plausible deniability. Russia just proved that it works. And this is where the brilliance of Russia's timing becomes undeniable. They didn't act at random. They waited for a moment of maximum Western vulnerability. It's winter. European energy demand is at its peak. Natural gas supplies are critical. Oil prices are volatile. The shipping industry is still trying to recover from COVID-era delays and the cascading effects of the Suez Canal blockage. On top of that, Western navies are spread thin, juggling commitments in Ukraine, rising tensions in the Indo-Pacific, and unresolved crises in the Middle East. Every naval asset that could have responded to this operation was already tied up elsewhere. Russia struck when the West could least afford to respond, and when its commercial lifelines were stretched to the breaking point. What makes this even more concerning is how it plays into broader strategic doctrine. Russian military leadership has spent the last 2 decades studying Western interventions in Iraq, in Libya, and Syria, and what did they learn? That direct confrontation with a superior military is foolish. Instead, target the soft underbelly. Don't attack strength, attack reliance. In this case, the West's reliance on uninterrupted global trade. The brilliance of Russia's move lies in how it flips the traditional logic of power. Instead of matching naval strength ship for ship, Russia targeted the nodes of global commerce, the arteries that keep Western economies alive. This is asymmetric warfare at a state level, and it's being carried out with tools the West thought it owned exclusively: insurance, legal precedent, and international norms. The $3 billion figure isn't just about sunk costs, it's about proof of concept. Russia showed that with careful coordination, It can paralyze key maritime regions and inflict massive economic consequences without a single missile being fired. But more importantly, this wasn't just a move, it was an opening, a first step, a warning shot across the bow of every Western shipping company, insurance firm, and policymaker. Adapt to the new rules or be left behind. Now those shipping companies are facing a terrible choice. Do they try to negotiate safe passage with Russia? Do they reroute entirely, adding time and cost that makes their business unviable? Or do they gamble, sail through contested waters without guarantees and hope they're not the next to be boarded? Each choice comes with consequences. The Northern Sea route, controlled by Russia, is the shortest path between Europe and Asia. The Black Sea is a lifeline for Middle Eastern and Central Asian exports. The Baltic is essential for trade out of Scandinavia. If shipping companies avoid these areas, the world loses access to the most efficient and cost-effective maritime corridors. And if they try to push through anyway, they do so under constant risk. And here's where the power dynamic becomes unmistakable. Russia now dictates who can use these routes and at what cost. Insurers are adjusting to this new reality rapidly. Coverage is no longer a given. Without Russian approval, direct or indirect, policies are being cancelled or denied outright. In practice, this means Western vessels must now pay for passage either in money, legal compliance, or political concessions. This is the modern form of tribute. It's the same strategy medieval empires used to secure trade routes, except now it's enforced by hypersonic missiles and nuclear submarines. No Western naval force can afford to challenge this directly, not without sparking a military escalation that no one is prepared for. This goes far beyond money. This is a shift in leverage, in influence, in global hierarchy. By controlling 3 strategic seas, Russia has positioned itself as a maritime gatekeeper. Any nation that wants to move goods through these zones must now calculate the political and economic price of doing so. And in this new landscape, Russia doesn't even need to make threats. The example has been set. The precedent has been created. The risk is already baked into every shipping decision moving forward. But the implications stretch even further. This move shows that sanctions aren't the shield the West thought they were. In fact, they've become a double-edged sword. Every financial blow dealt to Russia has created legal justification for Moscow to respond in kind. When the West froze $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves, they opened the door for Russia to target Western commercial interests of equal or greater value. When ports closed to Russian ships, Russia gained grounds to restrict access in return. Every policy meant to isolate Russia has now been weaponized in reverse and with devastating effectiveness. The result? A world where economic warfare is no longer an abstract concept. It's a daily reality on the high seas. Commercial vessels are no longer neutral. Global trade is no longer safe. The age of untouchable cargo ships is over. In its place is a new era, one defined by uncertainty, risk, and geopolitical calculations at every port and passage. The idea that you can move goods around the world without interference is now obsolete. And that realization is sending shockwaves through every logistics office, shipping firm, and finance ministry from London to Tokyo. The world isn't just dealing with supply chain delays anymore, it's dealing with supply chain warfare. And Russia is the first nation to openly and effectively deploy it. But they won't be the last. Now imagine the long-term consequences. What we are seeing isn't a passing crisis, it's a shift in the foundation of global trade. Russia didn't just cause temporary chaos, they rewired the system, and the implications stretch far beyond shipping delays or insurance hikes. This action, and the legal framework behind it, has created a chain reaction that other nations will almost certainly follow. Because the logic is simple and chilling. If you control a strategic choke point and you're willing to enforce your rules, you can dictate the terms of global commerce. Let's take China again. It dominates the South China Sea, through which over $5 trillion in trade flows every year. The world has tolerated China's creeping control, but now, with Russia's maritime strategy in hand, China has a working model. One they can use immediately to enforce their own territorial claims, not through naval conflict, but through targeted seizures, just like Russia. And then there's Iran. It controls the Strait of Hormuz, a passageway for 20% of global oil. If Iran were to mirror Russia's tactics, it could bring global energy markets to their knees overnight. All without launching a single missile. The blueprint has been drawn, and every sanctioned country, North Korea, Venezuela, Syria, is paying attention. But the genius of this new maritime warfare isn't just in the playbook. It's in how it flips every Western assumption on its head. For years, the West believed that economic warfare was a one-way street, that they could use sanctions as precision tools to punish nations without triggering military conflict. But now, that illusion has shattered. Because Russia's counterattack is precisely what sanctions were supposed to avoid: escalation. And worse, it escalates in a way that Western nations can't respond to without causing a larger confrontation. The real genius lies in the risk calculus. Every ship that Russia seizes isn't just an economic blow, it's a diplomatic grenade. Each seizure creates a crisis that demands a response. But how do you respond when the waters are disputed? When the legal justifications mirror your own? And when the alternative is to send naval escorts into contested zones? That's where the nightmare begins. Because once you escort commercial ships with military vessels, you've entered a new domain entirely. Now you're not just protecting trade, you're positioning for military confrontation. And if that confrontation happens in the Arctic, the Baltic, or near Crimea regions where Russia holds the geographic and tactical advantage you're playing into their hands, think back to the Cuban Missile Crisis. That crisis ignited when Soviet ships carried offensive weapons toward Cuba, threatening America's security and forcing a high-stakes standoff. But this time, the threat isn't weapons, it's economic lifelines. Russia now controls the flow of goods that keep European industries running and homes heated. And those shipping lanes, they're more valuable than any missile silo. Because energy, food, and raw materials are the modern world's ammunition. And the West just watched Russia seize the delivery systems. The result is a haunting new paradigm, one where Russia doesn't need to fire a shot to cause real damage. Their economy is structured to survive. They produce their own energy. They grow their own food. They extract their own minerals. Meanwhile, the West, especially Europe, is dangerously reliant on imports. In a world where shipping lanes are no longer safe, that dependency becomes a national security threat. And Russia knows it. Look at the timing again. Winter, inflation, fragile economies, ongoing conflicts in Ukraine, the Middle East, and tensions in the Indo-Pacific. Every Western nation is distracted. Supply chains are already buckling. And Russia adds one more pressure point, just enough to push the system further toward the edge. No overreach, no obvious provocation. Just enough disruption to force hard decisions. And that's the brilliance. Russia understands the fragility of modern systems. They've watched how the West overextends. They've studied how markets react, how governments hesitate, how media coverage shapes perception, and they're using it all. Not by attacking strength, but by exploiting weakness. Not by breaking the rules, but by using the rules the West created against the West itself. The scale of the operation, the precision of the timing, and the method of delivery all send one unified message. Russia is not just playing defense, they're reshaping the battlefield. They've taken the West's most sophisticated weapon economic leverage and turned it into a boomerang. One that hits supply chains, insurance systems, legal frameworks, and trade routes simultaneously. And it's working. Already, global shipping companies are re-evaluating their routes. Insurance underwriters are updating risk models. Logistics firms are calculating new delivery timelines. Governments are scrambling to figure out how to maintain access to critical goods. And this isn't about a temporary spike in shipping costs. It's about a permanent restructuring of global commerce away from efficiency and toward security. Because once the rules change, they don't revert. No insurer will forget that ships were seized without warning. No logistics firm will erase the delays caused by a legal vacuum. No government will pretend that maritime law still guarantees safe passage. That illusion is gone. And the new reality? It's a chessboard where the pieces aren't military battalions, but shipping lanes, insurance contracts, and energy flows. The rules of war are evolving, and Russia just proved they're not waiting for the West to catch up. The aftermath of Russia's maritime move is just beginning to take shape, but already it's revealing fractures in the Western alliance that have been quietly forming beneath the surface. While Washington can afford to view this crisis from a distance protected by geography and a more self-sustaining economy, Europe doesn't have that luxury. European industries are built on a delicate balance of imports: energy, raw materials, components, even food. And now that balance is being disrupted by a country that controls the routes those imports depend on. This isn't just about shipping, it's about survival. And each European leader is starting to realize that the sanctions they helped design are now putting their own economies at risk. Germany's chemical industry, one of the largest in the world, relies on critical imports that now face seizure or delay. The UK's food security is exposed, with key agricultural products passing through waters that Russia can disrupt at will. France's nuclear power network depends on uranium shipments, many of which transit zones now deemed high risk. These aren't distant threats, they're immediate vulnerabilities. And with each passing day of disruption, the pressure builds. Eventually, these governments will face a brutal choice: maintain unity with the United States and risk long-term economic damage, or quietly make arrangements with Russia to secure their own national interests. This is exactly what Russia anticipated. Sanctions were never just about economics. They were also a test of cohesion, of whether the West could act as a unified bloc in the face of resistance. Russia's latest move is designed to crack that unity, not by confronting the alliance militarily, but by creating incentives to defect. One by one, countries may begin negotiating separate terms with Moscow, not because they support its actions, but because they can no longer afford the cost of resistance. What we are witnessing is not just a geopolitical maneuver. It's a strategic campaign to weaken the foundation of Western cooperation itself. And the irony is almost poetic. The very sanctions meant to isolate Russia are now isolating the West. By creating a new risk landscape around key maritime routes, Russia has turned the tables completely. Every restriction placed on Russian assets has a mirror image, an opportunity for Moscow to retaliate in ways the West didn't anticipate, and still isn't prepared to counter. And while Western leaders continue to insist that sanctions are working, the reality on the ground and in the water tells a very different story. Because Russia didn't respond to sanctions by collapsing, they responded by adapting, by going on the offensive. Not with tanks or cyber attacks, but with something more subtle, more systemic. They've weaponized the world's dependency on movement, on the assumption that trade can happen freely and safely across borders and seas. And by proving that this assumption no longer holds, they've forced every actor in global commerce to reassess their models, their expectations, and their alliances. Even worse, the West has no easy counter. Military protection of commercial shipping isn't just costly, it's dangerous. Naval escorts in contested waters mean raising the stakes. And when those waters are controlled or monitored by a nuclear power, the margin for error shrinks to almost nothing. A single miscommunication, a misidentified radar blip, an overzealous commander, and you have an international incident, one that spirals far faster than policymakers can contain. So, the military option, while available on paper, is almost impossible to deploy in practice. Then there's the economic response. Retaliating against Russia's seizures with more sanctions might feel satisfying, but it's also predictable and likely ineffective. Russia has already prepared for further economic isolation. They've de-dollarized significant parts of their economy, built parallel financial systems with allies like China, and increased internal production to reduce foreign dependency. Every new sanction simply reinforces their pivot away from the Western order. It's a feedback loop that only accelerates the transition they already planned for. Diplomatic solutions? Also limited. A negotiated retreat would require Western leaders to admit that their strategy failed. That instead of isolating Russia, they've created a system where their own ships, companies, and citizens now face higher costs and greater risks. That kind of public reversal is almost unthinkable in today's political climate, which means the West is now stuck, trapped in a cycle where every move either deepens the crisis or reveals weakness. And that brings us to the heart of the matter. Russia is playing a different game. They're not seeking immediate victory or dramatic headlines. They're grinding away at the structural advantages the West has relied on for decades. They're turning global systems, insurance, logistics, legal precedent into battlegrounds. And they're doing it with a level of coordination and patience that most Western analysts never expected. The result is a new kind of warfare, one that doesn't require firepower to be effective, one that bleeds adversaries not through destruction, but through disruption. Russia's maritime seizures are just the first phase. The next steps are likely already underway. Tighter control of port access, expanded targeting criteria for future seizures, selective disruptions designed to pressure specific industries or nations. And all of it wrapped in the same legal logic that Western nations pioneered: This is what makes the situation so volatile. It's not just that Russia acted boldly, it's that their actions are rooted in the West's own legal and strategic precedents. They didn't invent this playbook. They studied it, adopted it, and now they're executing it with ruthless consistency. And unless something changes, they'll keep doing it. Because from their perspective, it's working. And from the outside, it's becoming harder and harder to argue otherwise. This entire strategy, the seizures, the timing, the legal mirroring, isn't just about retaliation. It's about shaping a new reality. Russia isn't waiting for a seat at the global table. They're flipping the table over and building a new one on their own terms. And the West? It's still trying to figure out what just happened. The most dangerous part of all this isn't the billions lost in shipping, or the lawsuits piling up in courts, or even the insurance markets in freefall. It's the fact that this shift cannot be reversed. Once the idea takes hold that commercial shipping is no longer protected, it doesn't go away. It becomes embedded. Every ship that leaves port now carries not just cargo but risk. And this new era of contested trade routes changes everything. Maritime insurance, once a behind-the-scenes function of global commerce, is now a frontline defense. And it's crumbling. Premiums have soared to unaffordable levels. Some underwriters are exiting the market entirely. Others are demanding Russian clearance before they'll insure anything that crosses through Arctic, Baltic, or Black Sea lanes. And shipping companies? They're scrambling. Routes are being replanned. Delivery schedules rewritten. Costs passed on to consumers. Delays stretching from days to weeks. This isn't some temporary crisis. It's a foundational reshaping of global trade. And it's happening fast. But even that's not the end of it. Because now, other nations are watching, and not just the ones already under sanctions. Strategic rivals, emerging powers, even neutral players. They're all re-evaluating the power of economic choke points. The logic is undeniable. Why spend billions on aircraft carriers when you can gain more leverage by controlling a shipping lane? Why engage in direct conflict when you can achieve your goals by rewriting the rules of access and legality? Russia just showed that you don't need to win on the battlefield to change the game. You just need to make the cost of opposition too high to bear. China, for instance, has the capability to take this exact strategy and apply it to the South China Sea, a region it already dominates militarily and claims legally, despite international opposition. If Beijing begins to enforce selective passage based on political alignment, it could reroute trillions in trade and fracture Western access to Asian markets overnight. Iran could do the same in the Strait of Hormuz, leveraging its influence to raise global energy prices by blocking Western tankers or by simply threatening to do so. These aren't theoretical scenarios anymore. They are now plausible strategies backed by precedent. That's the long-term impact of what Russia has done. They didn't just respond to sanctions, they built a roadmap for circumventing them. They exposed the West's reliance on systems that assume neutrality, safety, and global consensus systems that no longer exist. And every sanctioned or marginalized nation now sees a path forward that doesn't require compliance, submission, or even negotiation. Just control. If you hold the key to a trade route, you hold power. The West, meanwhile, is caught in a dilemma, with no clean exit. Escalate militarily and risk direct confrontation with nuclear powers. Escalate economically and watch those actions weaponized in reverse. Attempt diplomacy and face the political cost of acknowledging that sanctions failed. Every path forward leads to fragmentation, complication, and strategic retreat. And the longer the West waits, the more embedded Russia's new order becomes. The most pressing concern now is not whether this escalates, it already has. The question is how far and how fast. Russia's next moves are predictable. They'll expand their seizure criteria to include vessels from any nation directly supporting Ukraine's military. That means ships from Germany, Poland, the UK, possibly even the United States. Each incident will spark outrage, diplomatic condemnation, demands for military response. But the cost of each response will grow higher. And that's the trap. Every answer the West gives digs the hole deeper. What we are watching isn't just economic warfare. It's the strategic unraveling of the post-Cold War order. An order built on assumptions of free trade, global rules, and Western dominance of the seas. Russia is proving that dominance no longer exists, not in practice and not in perception. The West may still command a larger navy, control major institutions, and write the rules, but none of that matters if they can't enforce it. And enforcement is no longer about aircraft carriers. It's about choke points, risk modeling, and legal gray zones. This is asymmetric power at its peak, and it's not going away. Every commercial vessel, every port, every shipping insurance policy is now part of a larger battle. One that's not declared in headlines but felt in food prices, factory slowdowns, and political unrest. Western economies weren't built for this level of uncertainty, and Russia knows it. The final blow? This playbook can't be stopped, it can only be matched. Which means the world is now entering a phase where maritime law is subjective, trade routes are weaponized, and global commerce is no longer a stabilizing force but a tool of strategic domination. This is the future. And Russia just opened the first chapter.